Picture the 1980s. Neon colors so bright they probably caused long-term eye damage. Cassette tapes that needed a pencil for emergency surgery. Arcades glowing like sacred temples of beeps, buttons, and quarters. There was freedom everywhere. Kids roaming the neighborhood unsupervised, parents trusting vibes over GPS. But if you had an ADHD brain, that freedom came with a constant sense that you were somehow doing life incorrectly. Back then, ADHD wasn't widely discussed. Most of us didn't have a diagnosis. We didn't have a label. We just had feedback, lots of feedback. You were different, too loud, too restless, too distracted, too emotional, too sensitive, too dreamy, too intense, too much. Which is impressive, really, because you were also constantly told you weren't doing enough. After hearing those words enough times, they stopped sounding like comments and started sounding like facts. You didn't think, maybe this system isn't designed for me. You thought, so this is my personality flaw. And yet, somehow, an entire generation like this survived. Barely, but still counts. Before we rewind completely, take a second to like and subscribe. And while you're listening, think back. If you grew up in the 80s or if you live with ADHD now, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and whether you were labeled gifted, a problem, or the deeply confusing combination of both. Now let's go back. School in the 80s was built on obedience and straight lines, desks in rows, lessons that lasted forever, teachers talked, students listened, silence was golden, stillness was a personality trait. For an ADHD brain, this was not ideal. Your body did not come with a mute button. Legs bounced like they were powered by a hidden motor. Fingers tapped, twisted, dismantled pens for parts. You told yourself to stop moving approximately every 4 seconds, and then immediately forgot you told yourself that. Your mind, meanwhile, was doing parkour. It jumped forward to lunch, backward to something embarrassing you said last week, sideways into a completely unrelated fantasy scenario, and then, briefly, back to the math lesson, just long enough to miss the important part. The teacher's voice faded in and out like a bad radio signal, competing with buzzing lights, chalk squeaks, the sound of someone breathing wrong, and the very loud thought of, I wonder what would happen if I accidentally knocked this desk over. What made it worse was watching other kids manage it effortlessly. They sat still. They remembered homework. They raised their hands at appropriate times. You didn't resent them, you were just deeply suspicious of them. You noticed early that something worked for them that did not work for you. You just assumed they got a secret instruction manual you somehow missed. Teachers didn't see a neurological difference. They saw a discipline issue. You're not paying attention. Stop talking. Why can't you sit still like everyone else? You're smart, but you don't apply yourself. That last sentence followed many of us for years. It lived on report cards. It haunted parent-teacher conferences. It became the most polite way adults could say, you are confusing, and we do not know what to do with you. Homework wasn't hard. Homework was haunted. Not because the work was difficult, but because starting felt like trying to push a refrigerator uphill using only vibes. You knew what needed to be done. You wanted to do it. You stared at it. Nothing happened. Instructions were half remembered. Books were left at school. Papers disappeared into backpacks like they entered another dimension. 30 minutes of work somehow took 4 hours, including crying, snacks, pacing, staring at the wall, and then doing the assignment at 10:47 p.m. in a sudden, panic-fueled burst of brilliance. There were no accommodations, no movement breaks, no understanding of executive dysfunction. If you struggled, the assumption was simple. You didn't care, which was extra fun because you cared so much it physically hurt. ADHD kids were rarely invisible, though. We had a talent for being noticed, just not for the reasons we wanted. Without realizing it, many of us slid into one of three roles: the class clown, the troublemaker, or the daydreamer. Sometimes all three before recess. The class clown didn't plan to be funny. Humor just escaped. Jokes exited the mouth before the brain had time to file the proper paperwork. Sound effects appeared uninvited. Sarcasm arrived early and stayed too long. And when the class laughed, it mattered. Laughter felt like winning, like connection, like proof that you weren't only bad at things. For a kid constantly in trouble, laughter felt like oxygen. Teachers disagreed. Apparently, education was not meant to be entertaining. Who knew? Punishment followed, detention, missed recess. A stern lecture that started with, "I know you think you're funny." But classmates remembered you, and being remembered felt better than being ignored. Then there was the troublemaker. This kid did not choose chaos. Chaos chose them. Chairs rocked, feet bounced, pencils tapped until they mysteriously snapped in half. The urge to move wasn't defiance, it was biology. Your body felt like it would explode if you stayed still one more second. Bathroom breaks became strategic. Sharpening a pencil turned into a scenic tour of the classroom. Teachers assumed rebellion. In reality, your nervous system was screaming. Punishment became routine. Standing in hallways, writing lines, losing recess, detention again because clearly it hadn't worked the first 12 times. And then there were the daydreamers, the quiet ones, the kids staring out the window, fully checked out, while teachers confidently assumed they were absorbing information through osmosis. In reality, their inner worlds were vivid and loud. Entire movies played behind their eyes. Futures were planned. Conversations were rehearsed. Fantasies felt more real than the present moment. Because they weren't disruptive, they were often missed entirely, which sounds lucky until you realize no one noticed when they were drowning. ADHD didn't turn off when the school bell rang. At home, hyperactivity looked like misbehavior. Forgetfulness looked like irresponsibility. Emotional reactions were labeled attitude. No one talked about emotional regulation. No one explained impulsivity. No one mentioned that rejection could feel like a punch to the chest. The message was always the same. Try harder. So we did. We tried harder to focus, harder to behave, harder to remember, harder to be normal. Many of us learned to mask early. Humor became armor, charm became survival, chaos became just how you are. Inside, we were exhausted and didn't know why. Without understanding or guidance, ADHD kids in the 80s built their own systems. Video games became one of the most important. Arcades were accidentally perfect for ADHD brains. Bright lights, clear rules, immediate feedback, no waiting, no lectures, just press button, receive dopamine. You failed fast, tried again immediately, improved without boredom. For once, attention wasn't forced, it was invited, time disappeared, focus locked in. Adults called it addiction. In reality, it was regulation, with sound effects. Music played the same role. Walkmans became emotional support devices long before anyone used that phrase. Songs were played on repeat until family members begged for mercy. Lyrics were memorized instantly. Certain tracks calmed racing thoughts. Others let you feel things you didn't have words for yet. These weren't hobbies. They were coping mechanisms disguised as personality traits. By the 80s, researchers had already been studying attention disorders for decades. Society just hadn't caught up. Then Ritalin entered the conversation. It appeared quietly, carefully, usually after everyone was exhausted. To adults, it sometimes looked miraculous. Kids sat still, focus improved, teachers relaxed, parents felt hope. To kids, it felt complicated. Suddenly, adults liked you more. Expectations changed. Jokes about being on speed circulated. Some worried medication would erase the only parts of them that worked. In reality, medication didn't erase personality. It turned the volume down. Still, diagnosis was uneven. Loud kids were noticed. Quiet kids were missed. And kids were rarely asked how they felt. But something had shifted. There was finally a name, an explanation, a reason effort hadn't been enough. Looking back now, it's honestly shocking we made it through the 80s at all. No internet, no community, no one saying, "Oh, wow, same." And yet, we grew up. We became artists, musicians, programmers, entrepreneurs, parents who recognized their kids immediately. The class clowns learned timing and emotional intelligence. The troublemakers learned resilience and adaptability. The daydreamers learned imagination and vision. Traits once punished slowly became strengths. ADHD in the 80s wasn't kind. It was lonely, confusing, exhausting. But it forged people who learned to survive without instructions and somehow still kept their sense of humor. So how did we survive? We laughed when things hurt. We found stimulation where others saw distraction. We built meaning out of chaos. And we kept going, even when the system clearly had no idea what to do with us. And there's another part we don't talk about enough: the constant self-negotiation. ADHD kids in the 80s became experts at talking themselves through everything. You coached yourself silently all day long. Okay, just sit still for 5 more minutes. Don't say that. Definitely don't say that. Wait, was that homework due today? Pay attention. Pay attention. Oh no, it's over. Your brain was never quiet, but you learned to pretend it was. You learned to nod at the right moments, laugh when others laughed, and look busy when you had no idea what was happening. You mastered the art of appearing functional while internally running 15 parallel thought processes, 3 emotional reactions, and 1 random song stuck on loop. And the exhaustion from that? It didn't look like tiredness. It looked like irritability, or zoning out, or suddenly melting down over something small, like the wrong tone of voice or a missing shoe. Adults often said you were overreacting. You weren't. You were overloaded. But because ADHD kids in the 80s didn't have language for that, we assumed it was another personal failure. We told ourselves to calm down, toughen up, stop being dramatic. Meanwhile, our nervous systems were doing their absolute best with zero support and very questionable coping strategies. Some of us became perfectionists, terrified of messing up again. Some of us leaned into chaos because expectations hurt less when you never met them. Some of us did both, depending on the day. And yet, despite the confusion, the discipline charts, the missed recesses, the "if only you tried" speeches, we developed something rare. We learned how to adapt. We learned how to read rooms, how to recover quickly, how to think sideways when straight lines didn't work. Not because anyone taught us, but because we had to. And maybe that's why, even now, there's a certain recognition when ADHD adults find each other. That look that says, "Oh, you too?" If this story feels familiar, you're not alone. Like the video. Subscribe for more. And in the comments, tell us where you're watching from, and whether you were the class clown, the troublemaker, the daydreamer, or all 3.